Welcome to the Avram Davidson universe, where you will get to listen to some of the best short stories ever written. As a youth, Neil Gaiman fell in love with Avram's stories. Philip K. Dick adored him. Ursula Le Guin thought his tales wonderful, and Ray Bradbury compared him to Kipling. Each episode will include a special guest, an amazing short story, and a discussion of that story. Enjoy classic tales such as O'er All the Seas with Oysters, The Golem, The Sources of the Nile, and many others.
How could you be? It sounds like a story to me, yeah. Sounds like a story to me.
I'm really looking forward to today's episode. We're going to be speaking to Susan Emshwiller. Her father, Ed, and her mother knew Avram really well. They attended the Milford Writing Conference together. And today we're also going to be listening to The Woman Who Thought She Could Read, which was originally published in the Fantasy and Science Fiction January 1959 edition. And Ed Emshwiller actually did the cover. A couple of things, just love if you are enjoying the podcast to please join the fan club at www.avramdavidson.com, and you can find there, join the fan club. One of the things I thought I'd do in the story today that we're going to be listening to, there's a song, I Fall Down and Go Boom, and I thought I'd just play a few seconds of it just for enjoyment. And then in a little bit, we'll be talking to Susan.
I played horse down the street with my broom down the street. When somebody moved the street, I swore down and go boom. Then I got up on my horse. Broom, of course, was my horse. When somebody moved the horse, I swore down and go boom. I cried and ran home to Ma. It's better.
All right. Well, looking forward to chatting in a little bit with Susan. That was from Eddie Cantor, I Fall Down and Go Boom, 1929. So looking forward to the rest of the episode. Susan, how are you?
I'm good. How are you, Seth?
Good. Thanks so much for taking the time today.
Oh, sure. Happy to do it.
Yeah. So, I think introduction, I know you're a screenwriter and a writer, and several other things, but tell me a little bit about your background, and then I'll obviously tell why I reached out to you, but tell us a little bit about your background and what you're up to these days.
I grew up in Levittown, Long Island, with, the opposite of all the other Levittown folks that lived there. My parents were writers and artists and avant-garde filmmakers. So we were kind of the odd family in that suburban place. So I grew up with art all around me all the time. And me and my brother and sister, we just would play making movies or animating or writing stories or making plays, whatever it was. It was quite inducive to creating an artist. And so I ended up going to Syracuse University for painting and printmaking, and then Cal Arts for film. And then I got into the Hollywood industry doing art department, set decorating, while I was also writing screenplays and writing plays. And I got to co-write the film Pollock for Ed Harris. And
amazing.
Yeah, it was a fun experience, and directed several plays there, some of which have been published. And then LA is like many cities. It becomes so expensive if you're an artist. If you don't want to make a normal living, then you kind of have to leave. So my husband and I left, and now we're in Durham, North Carolina, which is much more conducive to art because the cost of living is so much less. So I've been writing a lot of novels and short stories now, maybe because I got so tired of not being able to be inside people's heads. Screenwriting, you're not allowed to. And so it's been really fun.
What do you mean by that when you say explain that a little bit more?
Well, I teach screenwriting at NCSU, and one of the things I have to keep reminding people is we're writing what we would see on the screen or what we would hear. That's all we're writing. We're not saying Joe felt his stomach rumble, because we can't see that on the screen. We can only see reactions to somebody holding their stomach and saying, "Oh my gosh, I'm hungry." So for years I've written without being in people's heads and not being able to have thoughts and not being able to have emotions that are actually articulated in an internal way. So it's like almost everything I write is first person now, because it's just like, yes, I get to be inside somebody's head.
And what's next for you? What's coming next? What should we look out for?
Well, hopefully I'll get, I'm just finishing a third novel. I have an agent, but so far I have not had the first two sucked up by the publishing machine. Maybe I'm just a little too weird, you never know.
What
brought up.
How would you describe your genre?
Weird. I would say I tend to write things that are somewhat realistic, but with one really odd thing that just cannot happen. But I try to incorporate it as if it's really real. So like I would say some people call it magical realism. Slipstream is also a term right now that people use. And I tend to have a lot of humor just because that's the way I think. It just comes out automatically.
Well, I hope we get an opportunity to read it. I'd certainly be excited to do so.
Yeah, I'd love to.
So your parents, I mean, one of the way we kind of started this conversation, and it is one of the most exciting things that I found. One of the things that I've been desperately searching for was some film of Avram, and I had nothing. And fortunately enough, you had posted some film from Milford, and tell us a little bit about that and who your parents were, and yeah. So
my mom was Carol Emshwiller. She was a science fiction writer, and my dad was Ed Emshwiller. Before he became an avant-garde filmmaker and video artist, he was a science fiction illustrator. So he would do the covers and the inner drawings of a lot of the magazines like Galaxy or Fantasy and Science Fiction magazine. And he became quite well known as Emsh, E-M-S-H. And he was first invited to the Milford Science Fiction Conference because of his drawings. And my mom, of course, went with him. And then she was so enthused about the writers there, Damon Knight, Kate Wilhelm, Harlan Ellison. I can't remember all the names of all the people, but
a lot.
She just said, okay, this is the kind of stuff I want to write. So she got way into science fiction, and then they would go each year to the Milford Conference, and they would take us kids. When the film I showed you, I think was 1959, because my brother was in a baby carriage, and I was probably 2, and my sister was probably 4. So we were young, and I do have a lot of memories of it. It took place in a huge, huge house. And then we would go in subsequent years, and the kids were never allowed in any of the the writing conference parts, but we would spy on the people from the balcony over the living room. Of course, it was incredibly boring to kids, having these adults just yammering on. But there was a lot to do and a lot of kids there, so it was a lot of fun. And then my dad would take home movies a lot, and he usually brought his camera there, and that's where that pictures of Avram. He was such a cool character, because in the movie he had like a straw hat and a wide striped one suit swimsuit, like the old, really old style. And he had a great character of kind of sometimes looking like a clown. And so that allowed all the kids to just, they would see him and they just rush up and glom onto him because he was so child friendly. And I was a very shy kid, and he was one of the only adults that I felt comfortable with.
Wow. Yeah. I mean, any other memories of Avram in particular, or?
I remember just him. Somehow I remember him around a tree, and maybe it was just like a peekaboo type thing, being behind the tree, and then his long beard peeking out. And usually he had this very flamboyant, colorful outfits on. So we kids were just like, oh, there he is, the fun guy.
And then I know that your father, as you said, he did a lot of the covers.
Yes.
I'm curious. I mean, I don't know. Is there any one particular that jumps out at you, or any favorite, or one that you just love of his?
Oh my gosh, there's so many. There was one with a banana, kind of peeled banana with one bite taken out of it, going through space. It's kind of like just this floating refuse that I liked that one a lot. There was one with a big purple monster that I loved as a kid because, kids just tend to love monsters. And it was purple, so great.
That's great. Well, I mean, I know it was interesting. I've been reading Avram's, it's sort of a short autobiography. It's not published. But he specifically mentions Milford, and he specifically mentions your mom and dad.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, and there, so that was really interesting. They clearly had an impact on him, and obviously he loved your father's art. So,
Yeah.
without saying. Well, today I think we're really lucky to listen to a story called "The Woman Who Thought She Could Read." And the cover, the original publication includes your dad's cover. So
Yeah, that's so cool.
Yeah. So I think with that, we could go ahead and get started and take a listen.
Great. Sounds good.
All right. Give me 1 second.
The Woman Who Thought She Could Read. About 100 years ago, a man named Vanderhorn built a little house. He built it 1.5 stories high, with attached and detached sheds snuggling around it as usual, and he covered it with clapboards cut at his own mill. He had a small sawmill down at the creek, Mr. Vanderhorn did. After that, he lived in a little house with his daughter and her husband, being a widower man, and one day he died there. So the daughter and son-in-law, a Mr. Hooten or Wooten or whatever it was, they came into his money, which he made out of musket stocks for the Civil War, and they built a big new house next to the old one, only further back from the street. This Mr. Wooten or Hooten or something like that, he didn't have any sons either, and his son-in-law turned the sawmill into a buggy factory. Well, you know what happened to that business. Finally, a man named Carmichael, who made milk wagons and baggage carts and pie wagons, he bought the whole Vanderhorn estate. He fixed up the big house and put in apartments, and finally he sold it to my father and went out of business, moved away somewhere. I was just a little boy when we moved in. My sister was a lot older. The old Vanderhorn house wasn't part of the property anymore. A lady named Mrs. Grummick was living there, and Mr. Carmichael had sold her all the property, the width of her house from the street on back to the next lot which faced the street behind ours. I heard my father say it was one of the narrowest lots in the city, and it was separated from ours by a picket fence. In the front of the old house was an old weeping willow tree and a big lilac bush, like a small tree. In back were a truck garden and a few flower beds. Mrs. Grummick's house was so near to our property that I could look right into her window, and one day I did, and she was sorting beans. Mrs. Grummick looked out and smiled at me. She had one of those broad faces with high cheekbones, and when she smiled, her little bright black eyes almost disappeared. "Little boy, hello," she said. I said hello and went right on staring, and she went right on sorting her beans. On her head was a kerchief. You have to remember that this was before they became fashionable, and there was a tiny gold earring in each plump earlobe. The beans were in 2 crocks on the table and in a pile in front of her. She was moving them around and sorting them into little groups. There were more crocks on the shelves, and glass jars, and bundles of herbs, and strings of onions and peppers and bunches of garlic all hanging around the room. I looked through the room and out the window facing the street, and there was a sign in front of the little house hanging on a sort of one-armed gallows. Anastasia Grummick, midwife, it said. "What's a midwife?" I asked her. "Me," she said, and she went on pushing the beans around, lining them up in rows, taking some from one place and putting them in another. "Have you got any children, Mrs. Grimmick?" "One. I got 1 boy. Big boy." She laughed. "Where is he?" "I think he come home today. I know he come home today." Her head bobbed. "How do you know?" "I know because I know. He come home, and I make bean soup for him. You want to go errand for me?" "All right." She stood up and pulled a little change purse out of her apron pocket and counted out some money and handed it to me out of the window. "Tell butcher Mrs. Grummick want him to cut some meat for a bean soup. He knows, Mrs. Schlutz. And you get ice cream comb with nickel for you." I started to go, but she gave me another nickel. "Get 2 ice cream combs. I eat 1 too." She laughed. 1, 2. 1, 2, 3. Oh, English language. Then she went back to the table, put part of the beans back in the crocks, and swept the rest of them into her apron. I got the meat for her, and ate my French vanilla, and then went off to play. A few hours later, a taxicab stopped in front of the little gray house, and a man got out of it, a big fellow. Of course, to a kid, all grown-ups are real big, but he was very big. Tremendous he was across, but not so tall. Mrs. Grummick came to the door. "Eddie," she said, and they hugged and kissed, so I decided this was her son, even before he called her Mom. "Mom," he said, "do I smell bean soup?" "Just for you I make it," she said. He laughed. "You knew I was coming, huh? You been reading them old beans again, Mom?" And they went into the house together. I went home, thinking. My mother was doing something over the washtub with a ball of bluing. "Mama," I said, "can a person read beans?" "Did you take your milk of magnesia?" my mother asked, just as if I hadn't spoken. "Did you?" I decided to bluff it out. "Uh-huh," I said. "Oh, no, you didn't. Get me a spoon." "Well, why do you ask if you ain't going to believe me?" "Open up," she ordered. "More. Swallow it. Take the rest, all of it. If you could see your face. Suppose it froze and stayed like that. Go and wash the spoon off." Next morning, Eddie was down in the far end of the garden with a hoe. He had his shirt off. Talk about shoulders. Talk about arms. Talk about a chest. My mother was out in front of our house, which made her near Eddie's mother out in back of hers. Of course, my mother had to know everybody's business. "That your son, Mrs. Grummick?" "My son, yes. What does he do for a living?" "Rachel." "No, I mean your son. What does he do?" "He Rachel. All over country. I show you." She showed us a picture of a man in trunks with a hood over his head. The masked marvel, wrestling's greatest mystery. The shoulders, arms, and chest, they could only have been Eddie's. There were other pictures of him in bulging poses with names like, the Slav Slayer, Chief Thunder Wing, Young Kehoe, and so on. Every month, Eddie Grummick sent his mother another photograph. It was the only kind of letter he sent because she didn't know how to read English, or any other language for that matter. Back in the vegetable patch, Eddie started singing a very popular song at that time called I fall down and go boom. It was a hot summer that year, a long hot summer, and September was just as hot as July. One shimmering, blazing day, Mrs. Grummick called my father over. He had his shirt off and was sitting under our tree in his BVD top. We were drinking lemonade. When I was a kid, he said, we used to make lemonade with brown sugar and sell it in the streets. We used to call out, brown lemonade, mixed in the shade, stirred by an old maid. People used to think that was pretty funny. Mrs. Grummick called out, hoo-hoo, mister, hoo-hoo. Yes, she wants me, my father said. He went across the lawn. Yes, ma'am, he was saying. Yes, ma'am. She asked, you buy coal yet, mister? Coal? Why, no, not yet. Looks like a pretty mild winter ahead, wouldn't you say? She pressed her lips together, closed her eyes, and shook her head. No, better you buy soon coal. Lots coal. Comes very soon bad weather. Bad. My father scratched his head. Why, you sound pretty certain, Mrs. Grummick, but, I know, mister. If I say it, if I tell you, I know. Then I piped in and asked, did you read it in the beans, Mrs. Grummick? Hey! She looked at me, surprised. How you know, little boy? My father said, you mean you can tell a bad winter is coming from the beans? It's true. I know. I read it. Well, now that's very interesting. Where I come from used to be a man, a weather prophet, they called him. He used to predict the weather by studying skunk stripes. Said his grandfather had learned it from the Indians. How wide this year, how wide last year, never failed. So you use beans? So I pushed my oar in and I said, I guess you don't have the kind of beans that the man gave Jack for the cow and he planted them and they were all different colors. Well, a beanstalk grew way up and he climbed. Father said, now don't bother Mrs. Grummick, sonny. But she leaned over the fence and picked me up and set me down on her side of it. You, little boy, come in house and tell me. You, mister, buy coal. Mrs. Grummick gave me a glass of milk from the nanny goat who lived in one of the sheds and a piece of gingerbread, and I told her the story of Jack and the Beanstalk. Here's a funny thing. She believed it. I'm sure she did. It wasn't even what the kids call making believe. It was just a pure and simple belief. Then she told me a story. This happened on the other side, in some backwoods section of Europe where she came from. In this place, they used to teach the boys to read, but not the girls. They figured, what did they need it for? So one day there was this little girl. Her brothers were all off in school, and she was left at home sorting beans. She was supposed to pick out all the bad beans and the worms, and when she thought about it, and about everything, she began to cry. Suddenly, the little girl looked up, and there was this old woman. She asked the kid how come she was crying. Because all the boys can read, but not me. Is that all? The old lady asked. Don't cry, she said. I'll teach you how to read. Only not in books, the old lady said. Let the men read books. Books are new things. People could read before there were books. Books tell you what was, but you'll be able to tell you what's going to be. And this old lady taught the little girl how to read the beans instead of the books. And I kind of have a notion that Mrs. Grummick said something about how they once used to read bones, but maybe it was just her accent and she meant beans. And you know, it's a funny thing, but now, if you look at dried beans, you'll notice how each one is maybe a little different shape, or maybe the wrinkles are a little different. But I was thinking that, after all, an A is an A, even if it's big or small or twisted or... But that was the story Mrs. Grummick told me. So it isn't remarkable. If she could believe that story, she could easily believe the Jack and the Beanstalk one. But the funny thing was, all that hot weather just vanished one day suddenly, and from October until almost April, we had what you might call an iron-bound winter. Terrible blizzards, one right after another. The rivers were frozen, and the canals were frozen, and even the railroads weren't running, and the roads were blocked more than they were open. And coal? Why, you just couldn't get coal. People were freezing to death right and left. But Mrs. Grummick's little house was always warm, and it smelled real nice, with all those herbs and dried flowers and stuff hanging around in it. A few years later, my sister got married, and after that, in the summertime, she and her husband Jim used to come back and visit with us. Jim and I used to play ball, and we had a fine time. They didn't have any children, so they made much of me. I'll always remember those happy summers. Well, each summer, a few of the churches used to get together and charter a boat and run an excursion. All the young couples used to go, but my sister always made some excuse. See, she was always afraid of the water. This particular summer, the same thing happened, but her friends urged her to come. My brother-in-law, he didn't care one way or the other. And then, with all the joking, someone said, "Let's ask Mrs. Grummick to read it in the beans for us." It had gotten known, you see. Everybody laughed, and more for the fun of it than anything else, I suppose, they went over and spoke to her. She said that Sister and Jim could come inside, but there wasn't room for anybody else, so we watched through the window. Mrs. Grummick spread her beans on the table and began to shove them around here and there with her fingers. Some she put to one side, and the rest she little by little lined up in rows. Then she took from one row and added to another row and changed some around from one spot to another. And meanwhile, mind you, she was muttering to herself, for all the world like one of these old people who reads by putting his finger on each word and mumbling it. And what was the answer? "Don't go by the water." And that was all. Well, like I say, my sister was just looking for any excuse at all, and Jim didn't care. So the day of the excursion, they went off on a picnic by car. I'd like to have gone, but I guess they sort of wanted to be by themselves a bit, and Jim gave me a quarter, and I went to the movies and bought ice cream and soda. I came out, and the first thing I saw was a boy my own age by the name of Bill Baumgartner, running down the street crying. His shirt was out and his nose was running, and he kept up an awful grinding kind of howl. I called to him, but he paid no attention. I still don't know where he was running from or where to, and I guess maybe he didn't know either, because he'd been told by some old fool who should have known better that the excursion boat had caught on fire with his parents on it. The news swept through town, and almost everybody with folks on the boat was soon in as bad a state as poor Billy. First, they said everybody was burned or drowned or trampled. Later on, it turned out to be not that bad, but it was bad enough. Oh, my folks were shook up, sure enough. But it's easier to be calm when you know it's not your own flesh and blood. I recall hearing the church clock striking 6, and my mother saying, "I'll never laugh at Mrs. Grummick again as long as I live." Well, she never did. Almost everyone who had people on the boat went up the river to where it had finally been run ashore, or else they waited by the police station for news. There was a deaf lady on our street. I guess her daughter got tired of its being so dull at home, and she'd lied to her mother, told her she was going riding in the country with a friend. So when the policeman came and told her, shouted at her they'd pulled out the girl's body, she didn't know what he was talking about. And when she finally understood, she began to scream and scream and scream. The policeman came over toward us, and my mother said, "I'd better get over there," and she started out. He was just a young policeman, and his face was pale. He held up his hand and shook his head. Mother stopped, and he came over. I could hear how hard he was breathing. Then he mentioned Jim's name. "Oh, no," my mother said very quickly. "They didn't go on the boat." He started to say something, and she interrupted him and said, "But I tell you, they didn't go." And she looked around kind of frantically, as if wishing someone would come and send the policeman away. But no one did. We had to hear him out. It was Sister and Jim, all right. A big truck had gotten out of control. "But they didn't go on the boat," my mother kept repeating kind of stupidly. "They had this warning, and so—" and smashed into their car. It fell off the road into the canal. The police were called right away, and they came and pulled it out. Oh, then they're all right," my mother cried. Then she was willing to understand. But they weren't all right. They'd been drowned. So we forgot about the deaf neighbor lady because my mother, poor thing, she got hysterical. My father and the policeman helped her inside, and after a while she just lay there on the couch kind of moaning. The door opened, and in tiptoed Mrs. Grummick. She had her lower lip tucked in under her teeth, and her eyes were wide, and she was kind of rocking her head from side to side. In each hand she held a little bottle, smelling salts maybe, and some kind of cordial. I was glad to see her, and I think my father was. I know the policeman was, because he blew out his cheeks, nodded very quickly to my father, and went away. Mother said in a weak, thin voice, "They didn't go on the boat. They didn't go because they had a warning. That's why—" Then she saw Mrs. Grummick. The color came back to her face, and she just leaped off the couch and tried to hit Mrs. Grummick, and she yelled at her in a hoarse voice I'd never heard, and called her names. The kind of names I was just beginning to find out what they meant. I was, I think, more shocked and stunned to hear my mother use them than I was at the news that Sister and Jim were dead. Well, my father threw his arms around her and kept her from reaching Mrs. Grummick, and I remember I grabbed hold of one hand and how it tried to get away from me. "You knew!" my mother shouted, struggling, her hair coming loose. "You knew! You read it there, you witch! And you didn't tell! You didn't tell! She'd be alive now if she'd gone on the boat! They weren't all killed on the boat, but you didn't say a word!" Mrs. Grummick's mouth opened, and she started to speak. She was so mixed up, I guess, that she spoke in her own language, and my mother screamed at her. My father turned his head around and said, "You'd better get out." Mrs. Grummick made a funny kind of noise in her throat. Then she said, "But, lady, mister, no, I tell you only what I see. I read there, don't go by the water. I only can say what I see in front of me, only what I read, nothing else. Maybe it mean one thing or maybe another. I can only read it. Please, lady." But we knew we'd lost them, and it was because of her. "They ask me," Mrs. Grummick said. "They ask me to read." My mother kind of collapsed, sobbing. Father said, "Just get out of here. Just turn around and get out." I heard a kid's voice saying, high and kind of trembling, "We don't want you here, you old witch. We hate you." Well, it was my voice. And then her shoulders sagged, and she looked for the first time like a real old woman. She turned around and shuffled away. At the door she stopped and half-faced us. "I read no more," she said. "I never read more. Better not to know it all." And she went out. Not long after the funeral, we woke up one morning, and the little house was empty. We never heard where the Grummicks went, and it's only now that I begin to wonder about it, and to think of it once again.
What'd you think?
Oh my gosh, how wonderful.
Yeah.
That was a great story. I love the narrator's voice.
Yeah.
And then the way that the Mrs. Grummick is, the way her words are spelled out, you know, if you not only if you hear it the way that's done, but the writing of it, you know, Rachel for wrestle, he Rachel. It's wonderful.
I love a few things that jumped out at me. I love the way Avram kind of built up the beginning. So he created this whole town and this, but it was done in just a couple paragraphs.
Exactly.
He created this whole place. And a couple of things that I found interesting was we never know, I don't think, and we can guess, but we never know where Miss Grummick is from.
Right.
We don't know where this town is exactly.
Right.
So there's a lot of missing information, but it's all there. Right.
It's like when Rachel, when we learn about the Rachel,
right.
we see these pictures, and he's called something Slav. So you go, oh, maybe it's a Slavic country. You know, you kind of got that feeling of Eastern European
right.
localization. But I liked the narrator saying somewhere the backwoods of Europe.
Right.
backwoods of Europe.
Right. Yeah, we don't know. Well, what I think really kind of fascinating from my perspective, given that you're a screenwriter, if you were treating this, how would you treat this? I mean, any thoughts on that from a screenwriting perspective?
Well, the voice of the narrator is so huge that I would probably want to have a voiceover of, like if you remember To Kill a Mockingbird, the movie, they had John Woodward as the narrator of the older scout, the girl. And so it was a really nice kind of juxtaposition of an older voice going along with what you saw as a young girl. And so I might do that. And because some of the narration is just, priceless. And then I think trying to capture that time period, which we're not sure exactly the time period either, but the fact that it's post-buggy time and that there are cars and people are taking milk of magnesia for just a dietary whatever as a normal course of your day. All of that really gave it a time period feel. So I think I would, as a screenwriter, want to really push that nostalgic feeling and the almost Norman Rockwell America, small town, that kind of that play by what's the famous play, Winesburg, Ohio.
Old Town, or
there's one Old Town and then Winesburg, Ohio type.
Okay.
Those really small communities. That have, so many. Go ahead.
Oh no, go ahead.
But I really love the end because it's so enigmatic. I'm just going to read it, and the narrator says, "And it's only now that I begin to wonder about it and to think about it once again." Which makes me go like, what's happening now for that narrator?
I cried. I mean, I got teary-eyed at the end for sure. After reading it, the first time I've read it a couple of times. The first couple of times I read it, it was really just trying to get through all of Avram's material. But this time I really had an opportunity to take my time reading it and then listening to it. And when I read it, I definitely, there was misty-eyed. I mean, it's really sad. She disappeared.
Yeah. And then what is making this narrator, however old that person is comparatively to this young boy, to be wondering about it now and thinking about it? It makes me think that maybe another tragedy has happened, or maybe some, just beans are on the counter, wow. You never know, but
anytime he'd see beans, I questioned during the entire story. I guess another thought that I had was, could she really read the beans?
Right. Yeah. Yeah. Because we know that the son came home, and that was correct. And then the winter was really bad. That was correct. And then don't go near the water or whatever. Don't go by the water. That was correct.
Right. No, I mean, you assume she does, but then on the other hand, this feeling of you got it all wrong. You didn't read it right, or you didn't tell us the necessary information. But she obviously explained that she can only read what the beans tell her. Yeah.
She can only read the words, so to speak, or the letters, and not the content of, yeah.
And I guess another thing that strikes me, talking about magical realism like we did earlier, I mean, that's kind of this particular story, I would think, would fall right in that genre. I mean, it's certainly not hard science fiction.
Yeah, I think so, for sure.
Well, one of the things I always love to do, I mentioned, was pick a couple characters and who I would cast as the parts. I thought about Eddie and Miss Grummick, the boy. I thought, and whoever the young popular actor would be at that time, I think would be perfect. But did you have any characters that sort of jumped out?
I didn't think of contemporary people. I thought of Ernest Borgnine as the son.
Okay.
The wrestler.
Yeah.
And then
who did you say for Eddie?
Ernest Borgnine.
Okay.
And then, I worked as a set decorator with Joaquin Phoenix when he was a very young kid.
Oh, wow.
And he was really great when he was like 7. And so I would have cast him as the young boy.
Oh, that's amazing. Well, I was thinking, kind of modern John Cena could have been Eddie's big wrestler. And then for Miss Grummick, I thought, I don't know if you've seen Orange is the New Black, or I think whatever.
Oh,
it is.
yeah.
And,
Yeah.
Kate Mulgrew, who plays Captain on the Voyager. She's Russian accent, that kind of Eastern European. So I thought she could be a great for Mrs. Grummick.
Yeah, that's perfect.
Well, anything else you'd want to add? I mean, I can't thank you enough for the obviously finding that video and sharing it with me. It's just spectacular. I'm waiting to get, the other thing I've been desperately searching for, which I believe I finally found, is Avram's actual voice.
Oh, wow.
I haven't listened to his voice since probably 1993 when he passed away. So I think I may have several hours, hopefully, knock on wood, but it sounds like I'm getting that. So
that sounds great.
Anything else you'd like to add?
No, it was really a joy to do this.
Yeah.
Thank you for sharing the story with me.
Oh my gosh, thank you so much. And again, keep me updated on how your books are going. I just can't wait to read them as well. Anything weird sounds awesome.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.